I never imagined a simple letter could turn my life upside down, especially one demanding thousands of dollars from a man who isn't even alive anymore. It started as a typical day in my quiet neighborhood, where my family's old house has stood for decades, a place full of memories and the quiet presence of my late father. That house was his pride and joy, and after he passed away, it became my responsibility to keep it in order and honor his legacy. I thought dealing with the Homeowners Association would be straightforward, just a routine check-in to update records and pay any outstanding fees. But what happened next felt like stepping into a nightmare I wasn't prepared for. I still remember the moment I opened the letter, the bold numbers catching my eye. 8-0 in fines. At first I thought it must be some kind of mistake. How could there be so many fines piled up, and all addressed to my father? He had been gone for over a year. I called the HOA office immediately, hoping for some explanation or at least an opportunity to clear things up quickly. Instead, I was met with confusion and a strange kind of indifference that made my stomach churn. It was as if they were determined to ignore the fact that the man they were fining no longer existed. The whole situation felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I was angry and overwhelmed, not only by the absurdity of the fines but by the coldness of the people handling the case. My father had been a decent man, someone who followed the rules and respected his neighbors. The idea that his name was being dragged through this mess was painful beyond words. And yet, here I was, stuck in a fight with a faceless bureaucracy that seemed unwilling or unable to do the right thing. I wasn't just facing a mountain of money I didn't owe. I was confronting a system that felt unjust and unyielding. As I tried to make sense of the situation, I realized this was more than just a personal battle. It was about standing up for basic respect and fairness in a world that often seemed to overlook both. What followed was a series of events that challenged my patience, my knowledge, and my resolve in ways I never expected. One afternoon, as I was sorting through the usual stack of mail, a heavy envelope caught my eye. It was from the HOA, their official seal stamped at the top. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite explain. Slowly, I pulled the letter out and unfolded it. The message inside hit me like a punch to the gut. There were dozens of fines listed, totaling nearly $8,000. All of them were addressed to my father. My heart sank. I stared at the paper, rereading the numbers, hoping it was some clerical error or a prank gone too far. But the weight of the fines felt very real, and the reality was impossible to ignore. I tried to keep calm as I made the call to the HOA office. The person on the other end was polite but firm, repeating that these fines had been accumulated over months due to various violations. Parking infractions, landscaping issues, late fees, even some alleged noise complaints. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could my father, who had passed away over a year ago, still be responsible for these things? I explained this to the representative, hoping it would stop the conversation right there. Instead, they told me that the fines were tied to the property, and that ownership records still listed my father as the responsible party. The frustration began to build. I asked how to update their records and prove that my father was deceased. The response was vague, almost like they didn't want to deal with it. I felt the first real wave of helplessness wash over me. It was clear the HOA was operating on autopilot, sending notices and fines without really checking their facts. I tried to push for a supervisor or someone who could make sense of this mess, but all I got was the same robotic explanations. The more I pressed, the more it seemed like I was just another voice lost in the system. After that call, I took a closer look at the list of fines. Some of them made no sense to me at all. There was a charge for a broken fence that had been repaired months before my father passed. Another for grass not being mowed, even though I had personally taken care of the yard during that time. There was even a noise violation for a party that never happened. It felt like they were inventing reasons just to fill up the bill. I wondered if anyone in the HOA had actually walked around the property or even checked their own records before sending these demands. My attempts to contact the HOA continued over the following weeks. Each time, I was met with the same cold formality. I sent copies of my father's death certificate and legal documents showing that the house had been transferred to me. I pleaded for someone to acknowledge the situation and halt these absurd fines. Still, the letters kept coming, sometimes 2 or 3 in a week, each one more threatening than the last. The HOA's persistence was maddening, but what shocked me most was the complete lack of empathy. It felt like they saw my father's death as irrelevant, as if he was just another debtor they could squeeze money from. With every new notice, my anger grew, but so did my determination. I knew this wasn't just about money. It was about fighting back against an unfair system that seemed designed to punish rather than protect. I realized I was up against more than just an administrative error. This was a battle I couldn't afford to lose. The more I learned, the more I understood that this fight would take everything I had to see through. From the moment I realized the fines were addressed to my deceased father, I knew I had to act quickly. My father had passed away quietly in his sleep over a year ago, and since then, I had been managing the house and affairs left behind. It was frustrating enough dealing with the normal grief and paperwork that death demands, but being told that the man who was gone owed thousands of dollars in fines made it feel like the wound was still being ripped open. I immediately gathered the documents that would prove his passing. The death certificate was official and unmistakable. I also had copies of the will and the legal paperwork that showed the property had been transferred to me as his heir. Surely that would be enough for the HOA to stop sending these letters and harassing my family. I sent the paperwork to the HOA along with a polite but firm letter explaining the situation. I hoped this would put an end to the nonsense. After all, how could they continue to fine a man who was no longer alive and had no ability to take care of his property or respond to their notices? Days turned into weeks, and despite my efforts, the fines kept piling up. The HOA seemed uninterested or incapable of updating their records. It felt like my father's death was invisible to them, like he had simply vanished from existence but somehow still owed them money. Each time I called, I was met with a similar response. The representatives would tell me they understood my situation, but that the fines were tied to the property and that until ownership records were updated, the charges would remain. When I pressed for details on how to make those updates, the answers were vague and unhelpful. It was clear that no one in the HOA was taking real responsibility. I even requested to speak with the board members, hoping to find someone with enough authority to resolve the issue, but I was met with silence or empty promises to look into it. The emotional toll was heavy. It was one thing to deal with the bureaucracy, but another to feel like my father's name was being dragged through the mud. He was a man who took pride in his home and respected the community's rules. The idea that this faceless organization was treating him like a delinquent after his death was deeply painful. I began to question whether this was a case of negligence or something more malicious. Worse yet, the fines themselves kept increasing. Late fees were added to amounts that should have been frozen or dismissed. The letters became more aggressive in tone, threatening liens on the property, or even foreclosure. I was furious and felt powerless at the same time. The HOA seemed to be using fear and intimidation tactics, hoping I would just give up and pay up for something that wasn't right. I spoke with close friends and family members about the situation, and their reactions ranged from disbelief to anger. Some advised me to hire a lawyer immediately, while others suggested going public with the story to pressure the HOA. I wasn't sure which path to take, but I knew I could not let this continue. This was not just a fight over money, it was a fight for my father's dignity and for my family's peace of mind. At one point I requested a face-to-face meeting with the HOA president and the staff handling my case. The meeting was tense and frustrating. I brought all the documents proving my father's death and my ownership of the house. I explained calmly how the fines were unfair and illegal under the circumstances, but the response was disappointing. The president shrugged and said the system was automated and that they had no choice but to issue fines until the paperwork was fully processed. I asked why the process took so long and why no one had bothered to pause the fines, but there was no real answer. I left the meeting feeling more alone and helpless than before. Throughout this ordeal, I realized the HOA's stubbornness wasn't just incompetence. It was a sign of a larger problem with how these associations operate. They hold power over people's homes and lives, but often lack transparency and accountability. The fact that they continued to penalize a deceased man without properly acknowledging his passing felt like a cruel abuse of that power. My determination grew stronger. I refused to let my father's name be tarnished by unjust fines or ignored death records. I knew I had to keep pushing, keep documenting every interaction and every letter, so that one day this nightmare would end. But at the time, each day felt like walking through quicksand, sinking deeper into a fight that seemed impossible to win. I was caught in a system that neither respected the living nor the dead, and it was taking everything I had not to give up. Dealing with the HOA felt like talking to a wall, but one person stood out in the worst possible way. Her name was Karen, and she quickly became the face of everything frustrating and unfair about this whole ordeal. From the first time we spoke, her tone was dismissive and almost condescending, as if she had all the power and I was just another bothersome nuisance wasting her time. I soon learned that Karen was the person responsible for managing my father's file and the endless stream of fines. I tried to keep my cool during our calls, but she had a way of pushing buttons without even trying. One afternoon, I called to explain once again that my father was deceased and to ask why the fines kept coming despite the documents I had already sent. Karen answered and immediately sounded irritated. She said she had no idea why the fines were still being issued, but that the system generated them automatically. When I asked why no one had fixed the error, she shrugged off my concern and told me there was nothing she could do until the paperwork was fully updated. It felt like she was reading from a script designed to shut me down. I asked if she could escalate the matter or have someone else look at it, but Karen was quick to shut down any suggestions. "I'm just doing my job," she said sharply. "If you want to talk to the board, you can send a written request. Otherwise, I don't know what else you want me to do." Her refusal to engage was maddening, but I stayed polite, hoping to keep the lines of communication open. As the weeks went on, every interaction with Karen became more difficult. Emails went unanswered or received cold, one-line replies that didn't address my concerns. When I called, she sometimes put me on hold for long stretches only to come back and tell me the same thing, that the fines were in the system and she had no idea how to stop them. The phrase became a frustrating mantra, as if ignorance was a valid excuse for harassing my family with thousands of dollars in unjust fines. One time, I managed to speak with Karen in person during a community meeting. I approached her quietly, hoping to explain the situation face to face. She listened, but barely looked me in the eye. When I asked her why she didn't take more initiative to resolve the issue, she shrugged again and said, "It's complicated. There are rules we have to follow." I told her that continuing to fine a deceased man was not just complicated, it was wrong and possibly illegal. Her response was a tight-lipped smile and the statement, "I'm sure you feel that way, but we have procedures to follow." The more I dealt with Karen, the clearer it became that she was either unwilling or incapable of doing anything to help. She didn't just ignore my father's death. She seemed almost proud of her bureaucratic stonewalling. At times, it felt like she enjoyed the power she wielded, no matter how unjust it was. I kept wondering if she truly had no idea about the laws protecting consumers and families from these kinds of abuses, or if she was just hiding behind that excuse to avoid accountability. I began documenting every interaction, writing down dates, times, and what was said. Karen's repeated claims of ignorance became part of the growing evidence I was compiling. It was clear she was the gatekeeper of the problem, and without her cooperation, nothing would change. But Karen's attitude wasn't just a personal obstacle. It was a window into how this entire HOA operated by ignoring the people affected and hiding behind bureaucratic language and broken systems. There was a strange kind of cruelty in how Karen handled things. She would occasionally throw in a sarcastic remark or a dismissive tone that made me feel like my concerns were trivial, like I was wasting her valuable time. On more than one occasion, she implied that if I didn't like the way things were handled, I could take my complaints elsewhere. It was a sharp reminder that in this system, residents like me had very little power. Despite the constant frustration, I tried to remain calm and focused. I knew getting angry wouldn't solve anything, and I needed to keep my head clear to fight this battle properly. But each conversation with Karen drained a little more of my patience. Her unwillingness to acknowledge the problem or take responsibility made it feel like the HOA wasn't just a distant bureaucracy. It was a hostile force intent on making my life difficult. Looking back, Karen was the personification of every unfair experience I had with the HOA. She was the voice on the other end of the phone, the face at meetings, and the obstacle blocking any chance of a fair resolution. Her repeated phrase, "I have no idea," became a symbol of everything wrong with this situation. It wasn't just ignorance, it was negligence, disregard, and a refusal to treat my father's death and our family's hardship with even a shred of respect. Facing Karen was like facing a wall of apathy and defiance, wrapped in a veneer of professionalism, and it was only just the beginning of the fight I was about to wage. It was during one of the many sleepless nights, as I scrolled through online forums and legal websites, that the reality of what I was dealing with began to crystallize. The more I dug into HOA rules and regulations, the more I realized that the situation wasn't just unfair or poorly handled, it was actually illegal. At first, it felt overwhelming to learn about all the laws and protections in place, but it quickly became clear that the HOA's actions were crossing serious legal lines, and Karen's repeated claims of ignorance were no excuse. I started by searching for any mention of fining deceased individuals, something I hoped would be a straightforward issue. I found references to the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and other federal regulations that protect consumers from unfair debt collection tactics. According to these laws, once a person is confirmed deceased, any outstanding debts or fines tied to them cannot simply be transferred to family members without proper legal process. Moreover, debt collectors and organizations like HOAs have a responsibility to stop collection efforts once they receive proof of death. The fines being sent to my father were not only inappropriate, but appeared to be in direct violation of these protections. Digging deeper, I discovered that the HOA had an obligation to update their records immediately after receiving a death certificate. Continuing to send fines and threaten liens or foreclosure on a property that was legally transferred to me was more than just poor customer service. It was a violation of my rights and an abuse of the HOA's power. I read stories from others who had faced similar issues, where HOAs or debt collectors ignored death certificates and continued harassment, only to be stopped after legal action or intervention by government agencies. Armed with this knowledge, I started compiling everything I had. I gathered copies of all correspondence between me and the HOA, especially the letters and emails where I sent proof of my father's death and legal ownership of the property. I printed out the fines themselves, the threatening language they used, and the repeated insistence that the fines were valid despite clear evidence to the contrary. Each piece of paper felt like a weapon in a battle I never wanted but was forced to fight. As I organized these documents, I realized that Karen's repeated refrain of, "I have no idea," was not just frustrating, it was dangerously negligent. Whether through ignorance or willful blindness, she was allowing the HOA to break federal laws. I knew this wasn't a simple case of miscommunication or delay. It was a systemic failure that demanded a response beyond phone calls and polite emails. I reached out to a local legal aid organization for advice, hoping they could help me understand my options and possibly intervene. The attorney I spoke with was shocked by the situation but not entirely surprised. She explained that HOAs often operate with very little oversight and that many residents find themselves trapped in similar situations, especially when the rules aren't clearly enforced or when HOA boards hide behind administrative processes to avoid accountability. The lawyer confirmed that the HOA's continued fining after receiving the death certificate was a violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and possibly other state laws protecting homeowners from unfair treatment. She suggested I could file a formal complaint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and that there might be grounds for a lawsuit if the HOA refused to correct their records and stop the harassment. I also learned about the possibility of contacting my state's Department of Real Estate or an equivalent regulatory body that oversees HOAs. These agencies sometimes investigate complaints about abuses of power or failures to comply with the law. The idea that there were organizations tasked with protecting homeowners was a relief. It meant I was not completely alone in this fight. While researching, I found others online who shared stories of HOAs issuing unfair fines or ignoring death certificates, and how they eventually forced change by publicizing their experiences or seeking legal help. Their stories gave me hope. I wasn't just a frustrated homeowner. I was part of a larger community of people fighting back against an often unregulated system. In the midst of this, I also took time to learn more about the exact rules my HOA had put in place and whether those rules themselves were fair or legally sound. Many HOAs have broad powers to fine residents, but these powers are limited by state laws and federal protections. The more I understood, the more apparent it became that my case was not only about correcting mistakes, but about holding the HOA accountable for abusing their authority. Karen's attitude, once just an annoying obstacle, now felt like a deliberate shield protecting illegal actions. The repeated, "I have no idea," phrase no longer seemed like ignorance, but a refusal to engage with the facts and a way to dodge responsibility. It was infuriating, but it also motivated me to be more meticulous and more persistent. Each night, I added to my growing folder of evidence, prepared to take the next steps that would force the HOA to comply with the law. I wrote detailed notes about every phone call, every email, and every interaction with Karen and others. I felt like a detective building a case, slowly but surely assembling the truth that would set things right. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that this was not just a personal fight, but a fight for justice. The laws were there to protect people like me and my family, but only if we were willing to stand up and demand that they be enforced. The road ahead was going to be difficult, but for the first time, I felt like I had a real chance to win this battle. I realized that ignorance was not a valid excuse for the HOA or Karen. They were bound by rules and laws that protected homeowners, and they had deliberately or recklessly chosen to ignore them. I was ready to hold them accountable and to make sure that no other family would have to endure what mine had gone through. This knowledge gave me strength and a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but I now had the tools and the determination to see it through. As the reality of the situation sank in, I knew that passive frustration wouldn't get me anywhere. I had to fight back with every resource available to me. The pile of unjust fines was not just a figure on paper, but a direct assault on my family's dignity and financial security. It was clear that Karen and the HOA were not going to stop on their own, so I decided it was time to take formal action. This was no longer about polite phone calls or hopeful emails. It was about holding them accountable through official channels. I started by drafting a detailed complaint to the HOA board. In it, I laid out the entire history: the death of my father, the transfer of ownership, the repeated notices, and the legal protections that they were violating. I included copies of the death certificate and the legal documents confirming my ownership. I made it clear that the fines were invalid and that continued attempts to collect them would leave me no choice but to seek legal remedies. I sent this letter via certified mail so there would be proof they received it. I wanted to make sure my voice was heard and that the board could no longer pretend ignorance. Weeks passed with no meaningful response. The HOA continued sending threatening letters and warnings about liens and possible foreclosure. It felt like they were trying to intimidate me into silence or submission. I refused to back down. Realizing the limits of dealing only with the HOA, I expanded my approach. I reached out to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the federal agency tasked with protecting consumers from unfair debt collection practices. Filing a complaint there felt empowering. It was a way to take my grievances beyond the local bureaucracy and put pressure on the HOA to comply with federal law. The process was surprisingly straightforward. I submitted all my documentation and a clear narrative of the events. I knew this wouldn't be an immediate fix, but it was a critical step in holding the HOA accountable. At the same time, I contacted my state's Department of Real Estate, which oversees homeowners associations and has the authority to investigate complaints of misconduct or violations of state laws governing HOAs. This agency offered a different kind of leverage. While the CFPB focused on debt collection practices, the Department of Real Estate could scrutinize the HOA's operations more broadly. I explained the ongoing harassment and the failure to update records despite clear evidence. I also requested an investigation into the HOA's practices and the behavior of individuals like Karen who seemed to disregard legal requirements. Seeking legal advice was the next step. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney who specialized in real estate and consumer protection. She reviewed my case with a careful eye and confirmed that the HOA's actions were likely unlawful under multiple statutes. The attorney explained that if the HOA persisted, I could pursue a lawsuit for damages and a court order to stop the fines permanently. She also advised me on how to document everything meticulously, which I had already started doing. Her encouragement strengthened my resolve. With legal backing, I felt more confident in demanding a resolution. I sent another letter to the HOA, this time referencing the federal laws and state regulations, warning them of potential legal consequences if they failed to cease the fines and update their records. I emphasized that my family was prepared to take all necessary steps to protect our rights. This letter was more forceful than my previous attempts, but I remained professional and factual. The HOA's response was slow and tepid. They acknowledged receipt of my complaints but continued to dodge direct answers. Karen was still the point of contact, and her dismissive attitude remained unchanged. The aggressive letters threatening liens continued to arrive. making it clear that the HOA was either unwilling or unable to follow the law without external pressure. Around this time, I discovered a local homeowners advocacy group. Connecting with others who had faced similar battles gave me hope and practical advice. They shared strategies for dealing with obstinate HOAs and encouraged me to keep records of every interaction. They also suggested involving the media if things reached a stalemate, knowing that public exposure can often push these organizations to act more responsibly. Despite the mounting pressure, the emotional toll was undeniable. Every new letter or call from the HOA was a reminder that this fight was far from over. I felt drained but not defeated. My family rallied around me, offering support and encouragement when the frustration threatened to overwhelm me. We talked about the importance of standing up not just for ourselves but for others who might be trapped in similar situations. In one of the more tense moments, I received a certified letter from the HOA demanding immediate payment or threatening foreclosure. I brought this letter straight to my attorney. She immediately drafted a cease and desist letter on my behalf, warning the HOA that any foreclosure attempt under these false pretenses would be met with a legal injunction and claims for damages. This letter seemed to shake the HOA for a moment. They paused their aggressive notices for a few weeks, and for the first time, I sensed they were starting to take me seriously. Throughout this process, I remained diligent in documenting everything. I kept copies of every letter, recorded phone calls where legal, and logged every conversation with HOA staff and board members. This record would be vital if the dispute escalated to court or mediation. The battle to clear my father's name and protect my family's home was becoming a test of endurance and willpower. I had discovered that fighting an unyielding bureaucracy required more than just evidence and facts. It demanded persistence, knowledge, and sometimes the willingness to escalate matters through formal complaints and legal channels. Though the road was long and exhausting, I held on to the belief that justice was on my side. With each step I took, the fine print of the law became my armor. The unjust fines might have started as a cruel mistake, but they had turned into a fight for fairness that I was determined to win. The HOA's refusal to do the right thing would no longer be tolerated. I was ready to keep pushing until my family's name was cleared, and this nightmare finally ended. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized this experience changed me in ways I never expected. What began as an absurd and painful series of fines against my deceased father turned into a harsh lesson about standing up for what is right, even when faced with cold indifference and bureaucratic stonewalling. It was more than just about money or paperwork. It became a fight for respect, for dignity, and for justice in a system that too often ignores the very people it is supposed to serve. The frustration and anger I felt were real and sometimes overwhelming. Yet, through the struggle, I learned the importance of persistence and knowledge. Knowing the laws and understanding my rights gave me the strength to push back against an unfair situation. It taught me that sometimes the only way to make change is to refuse to stay silent, to demand accountability, no matter how small the battle may seem. I hope that by sharing my story, others who find themselves trapped in similar fights will feel less alone and more empowered to stand up. HOAs hold a lot of power, but that power is not limitless. There are laws in place to protect homeowners, and those laws matter. It is crucial that people know their rights and are willing to fight for them, even when the opposition seems overwhelming. In the end, this was not just my fight. It was about honoring my father's memory and protecting my family's future. The road was difficult and exhausting, but I am proud that I did not give up. No one should have to endure what we did. If anything, I hope this experience sparks more awareness and change so that no family faces such injustice again.